Welcome back. The idea that BRICS countries are trying to move away from the dollar while we stand by and watch is over, Trump said in a post to his Truth Social network on Saturday. To talk to us about this is our very special guest, director at the University of Johannesburg Center for Sociological Research and Practice, Professor Trevor. I beg your pardon. Have I got the guest? I'm sorry, Professor Patrick Bond from the University of Johannesburg. You know, you people from the University of Johannesburg are just invading my program today, so I
Well,
got that.
Trevor and I are in absolute agreement. I'm flattered to be considered
Yeah.
his successor on this one.
Thank you very much, and thanks for pardoning me for that mistake. Welcome, Professor Patrick Bond.
Thank you. It's great to be with you, Najma. Salam alaikum.
Walaikum salam. So, what does this mean for South Africa?
You know, I think the main dilemma for Donald Trump is he despises South Africa. He was tweeting during his presidency about the so-called white genocide. That would be farmers usually killed under circumstances that are more criminal and not necessarily political. So I think the dilemma is his deep racism. We know that comes out in so many ways. He describes African countries as S-holes. I don't think he'll even bother coming to the G20 meetings hosted in Johannesburg in November that President Ramaphosa took the year's ownership over from Brazil this last couple of days. And I think the overall threat to South Africa doesn't have anything to do with the dollarization debate, but instead over South Africa's International Court of Justice prosecution of Israel as genocidal. And I think that's where the extreme Zionism, not only in Trump's own mind and his family, because Benjamin Netanyahu used to sleep in the bedroom of Trump's son-in-law when he visited New York many years ago. And so there's a very tight personal relationship. But the new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, is a hardcore Zionist as well. So that's going to be the point of conflict. But just keep in mind, South Africa may talk left and go to the ICJ and prosecute very bravely the Zionist entity, but it actually walks right by being, at this moment, the number one coal supplier to Israel through Glencore and Patrice Motsepe's African Rainbow Minerals. And there's usually about one huge coal ship every month that goes from the Richards Bay export terminal to Hadera power plant with the Orat Rabin power station, fueling the genocide, and also going against the UN General Assembly's decision in September to support trade sanctions against Israel in the sense that trade would help the illegal settlements, which obviously coal does, being about 18% of the energy supply. Now, I'm off topic because you're interested in the particular question of whether Trump is reading properly. The BRICS are de-dollarizing, and I don't think that's the case for a whole set of other reasons we should discuss.
No, but we appreciate the overall background that you just briefly highlighted. I think it sheds a lot of light on where we stand geopolitically as South Africans and our role as such. So that, whenever I speak to you are a political economist, but even the analysts, at the end of the day, this just makes things so much more complex to understand in terms of, for us at grassroots level. For us, it's about how much is my bread going to cost tomorrow, right? And how does this then impact on that and our understanding of us as South Africans and our political role in the global, stage, on the global stage?
Well, I think the major question that listeners and viewers might be considering is if Trump would go through with a threat to target the BRICS and put 100% tariffs on our exports to the United States, who would be hurt? And the number one exporter has been Mercedes with luxury cars. These are not electric vehicles. We make none in South Africa. They're diesel and petrol cars. Secondly, Trump already in 2018 put some tariffs on South African steel and aluminium. So the areas that have steel foundries or the big aluminium smelter at Richards Bay, those may find that they lose 10 to 20% of their output. A third area would be the grapes and horticultural output and the wines from the Western Cape. And that's an area where there's a lot of, let's say, labor intensive, but very, very exploitative relationships between the usually white owners of that agricultural output and vineyards on the one hand and the black workers. If I think then about whether this potential tariff or getting rid of the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act would have an impact on the ordinary person, my sense is it would actually improve life because electricity goes into these outputs, especially aluminium, the number one user of our electricity, BHP Billiton, South 32 smelter, which is importing bauxite from Australia and Guinea, and it exports most of that. And they use our cheap coal-fired electricity. They get it at 30 cents a kilowatt hour. And you and I would be paying about £2.50 per kilowatt hour. And so the shortages of electricity, which I think will resume because Eskom remains in a death spiral, as you see by their incredibly high tariff increase demands, that would then allow South Africa to move some electricity away from the smelting and deep mining and capital intensive production and into labor intensive industry and into small businesses and into households, especially the households where women have responsibilities due to patriarchy of cooking and making sure the house is warm with heating. Those are the sorts of, let's say, unintended positive consequences if we have less exports to the US. But of course, jobs would be hurt. We need a just transition. There is allegedly money. But I think what Trump would really be angry about is if we did something quite logical, which is to reconsider financial relationships. And that would include pushing the BRICS to really de-dollarize, not just the rhetoric of maybe a internecine trade between the countries using more national currencies like a rand and a rupee, or a rand and a ruble, a rand and a renminbi, a rand and a real. Those are the 5 core BRICS countries that have currencies beginning with the letter R. And that could be done if there were trade balances that were relatively even. It wouldn't be that hard. The problem, of course, has been that if you run a trade surplus, Russia sends lots of cheap energy to India, then they end up with lots of rupees sitting around, and India has strong exchange controls. So Russians are frustrated at not getting their money back. The other relationship of note is India and China, where they just don't want to use each other's currencies. Now, those, I hope, would be dealt with by a BRICS pay mechanism that is being developed. But the main problem, I think, remains that the elites in our countries, and that not only South Africa, and not only because of a government of neoliberal unity, the GNU from June, where the DA, which is very supportive of Israel's genocide, as John Steenhuisen put it, one side's genocide is another side's freedom fighters. So that's let's say, the logic of mass murder you get in this GNU, in that partnership. And Ramaphosa, and especially Enoch Godongwana, the finance minister, Lesego Kganyago, the Reserve Bank governor, and the major banker in the country, Sim Tshabalala from Standard, they all reported to the BRICS in August 2023. If you remember, we had the summit here in Sandton, and they said, don't do de-dollarization, because that'll alienate basically the Western financiers. And even the BRICS New Development Bank put financial sanctions against a 20% owner, Russia, because of its illegal invasion of Ukraine. So you can see the complexities and the durable, let's say, capitalist immersion that will prevent us from doing the right thing to move to de-dollarization.
So we're going to take a break, but before that, I just want to quickly ask the question so you can give it some thought. Should we be taking this threat seriously? When we come back, Professor Patrick Bond will answer this question.
Feeling out of reach? Yasin Badat Financial Advisory is here to turn your aspirations into achievements. Our dedicated team, armed with a history of success, is ready to guide you through the complex nature of financial and investment planning. Whether you're a seasoned investor or new to the game, our personalized solutions cater to your unique goals and risk appetite. Trust in our commitment to transparency, integrity, and excellence. Ready to unlock a world of financial freedom? Partner with us today. Call Yasin Badat Financial Advisory at +27 33346 2071 or visit www.yasinbadat.com. Yasin Badat Financial Advisory, guiding you to financial success.
When the perfect blend of stylish decor, exquisite halal cuisine, and warm hospitality come together, it could only mean Al Bayt Lodge, your true home away from home. Al Bayt is the ideal heaven for families, business people, and tourists, with its 4-star family rooms and other luxurious facilities, conveniently situated close to Port Elizabeth Airport, the beach, and other amenities. Your stay will be truly unforgettable, as you'll be taking home lasting memories of the warm hospitality, the serenity and tranquility that Al Bayt has to offer. For reservations, call 041 583 6415 or visit www.albaytlodge.co.za.
Our brothers and sisters in Palestine are enduring unimaginable hardships. Ashraful Aid teams are on the ground, delivering crucial aid to those in need. But we can't do it alone. Palestine is suffering and they need your help. Your support can make a world of difference. Visit www.ashrafulaid.org today and donate to bring hope, relief, and healing to those who are in need.
Connect and stay ahead with Salam Media. This is Salam.
You're with Nashma Kota on News and Views this morning. My very special guest during this hour is political economist Professor Patrick Bond. Before the break, the question was, should we be taking this threat seriously?
Thanks, Najma. I think anytime Donald Trump makes a bullying, hectoring threat of this sort, we can, first of all, I think, assume that he is the world's greatest ever con man, and he's bluffing. And the reason that is important because his real tool isn't to somehow, punish South Africa through, let's say, a geopolitical standpoint. This is where the accusations of Israel's genocide may tempt him, but it's actually through putting on tariffs. And what we know is that the more he does that, for example, the threats to put on tariffs to his neighbors, Mexico and Canada, have created all sorts of reactions. He begins to lose his own capitalist class supporters, and he would cause major inflation. His ability to control the currency, to do quantitative easing, printing money, his ability to raise or lower interest rates, as he would like to push the Federal Reserve to do, those would all be limited if he takes these sorts of profoundly isolationist and punitary measures. However, I think what we're getting with him, particularly because he's got a pro-warrior, neoconservative network around him, such as Marco Rubio and his potential Minister of Defense, who's a very, very foolish, shoot-from-the-hip kind of American misogynist. Those sorts of characters work against his anti-war instincts, his paleoconservatism, in which he would retreat from the obligations of the US to run the imperialist system with 800 military bases. So he's got a major conflict internally, and I think we've seen that here in South Africa even just 2 weeks ago when the United States sent its National Endowment for Democracy, a wing of the non-profit and arm's length from the state, but very much a wing of US imperialism, the sort of soft power side. And we had a terrible controversy in South Africa about whether we should be giving that institution legitimacy for its big conference at the Sandton Convention Center that began just 2 weeks ago. And it split progressive movements. It made for terrible ruptures within the Tutu Foundation, within COSATU, the trade union movement. So I'm hoping that in the next 11 months, as we sort of everyone positions themselves to understand what it is to sort of be the leader of a G20 that fuses Western imperialism, the G7, and the BRICS, a sub-imperial alliance, let's say, an assimilation by the West of these up-and-coming countries. What would be on offer when Donald Trump is moving away from, let's say, a neoliberal multilateralism and instead promoting his own self-interest, which, as this particular episode shows, is really hard to work out because he says so many absolutely zany things.
I'm quoting now, the US cannot both reduce its trade deficit and increase the global dominance of USD because these impose diametrically opposed conditions. So
yes, that's right.
Right. So can you help us understand the statement?
Yeah, I mean, what's really at stake in that statement is that trade is one of the three main reasons that you have this dollar dependency, because it means you can always use a dollar to make even what are uneven trade relations. For example, as I said, Russia exporting much more in the way of energy to India, and India with very few exports back to Russia, leaving a trade imbalance. You need, therefore, this medium of exchange. Secondly, you need a store of value. And a lot of people take that Benji, the Benjamin Franklin $100 bill, as exactly that store of value, and they use it when their own currencies are going down as some sort of insurance. But the third thing that is crucial about this US dollar is that the Federal Reserve in Washington has this power to print, just free printing of money. When you and I want to buy something, we have to produce and work hard, and then we have enough resources to buy what we want. The US is different, they just print. But secondly, they not only can print and therefore create artificial stimulation, but also they can raise the interest rates, which they did. In fact, when I worked at the Federal Reserve, paying back my student loans in the 1980s, the main man there, the Federal Reserve Chair, Paul Volcker, put the interest rate up so high it caused the third world debt crisis, enormous damage. The same happened when Jerome Powell put the interest rate up, although not so much, but still with devastating effect in 2022. Only stopping that raise this year. And you could see what happened in Africa with Ghana, with Zambia, with Ethiopia going bankrupt, with the kind of pressures from the IMF that led to near revolutions in Kenya in June, Nigeria in August, now underway to some extent due to the IMF in Mozambique. And of course, we have big pressures because of an IMF loan taken off in 2020 that leads to cuts in our own budget. So this is the dilemma, right? That the US just has way too much power with that dollar. And I hope those who talk about de-dollarization aren't simply thinking about what Vladimir Putin or the Iranian leaders are, which is sanctions or being the victim of a weaponization of the currency, or seizures of assets are being kicked out of the SWIFT, but actually think about whether we can get another Bretton Woods conference or somehow de-link more exchange controls, defaults on the odious corrupt debts, the many debts to US institutions, the World Bank and IMF would qualify here. And those are the sorts of genuine de-dollarization measures I just wish the BRICS really would start thinking about instead of posturing.
Which probably leads us into our next comment, question, and of course your input, again making us understand it a bit more. Despite the group's rhetoric, the infrastructure that backs the dollar, such as the cross-border payment system, will likely give the US currency a decisive edge for I don't know how long. So infrastructure that backs the dollar, will this give the US currency a decisive edge?
Indeed, and we just saw that 2 weeks ago when Saudi Arabia needed money. Not very much, $2 billion. And you can ask why, because they've got such huge reserves. But they decided to work with China, which issued the very first US dollar bond by a different sovereign country that then Saudi Arabia could sell. And they had 20 times more hopeful buyers because it was basically a US Treasury bill, but that was guaranteed by China. So it had all that much more security. And although banks certainly will make loans in dollars, the BRICS Bank mainly makes loans in dollars and euros. and many other international banks take their dollar reserves and on lend in dollars. This is one of the ways in which this infrastructure is being strengthened. We thought Saudi Arabia might take a step away from the dollar with the petro yuan. In other words, the Chinese currency, the yuan, being the basis for trade between Saudi Arabia and China in oil. And, that's a very controversial thing to do, given the petrodollar was the way in which in the early 70s, those West Asian oil producing countries were sucked into the US orbit, and a huge amount of US dollars then were recycled through US banks when the OPEC, right, the oil producing exporting cartel, could actually increase their massive increase in price and therefore money. And you see that petrodollar geopolitically was always understood to be terribly important. So when China in early 2023 offered a petro yuan to get some non-dollar denominated payments for oil, well, we thought that might move somewhere. But now we're seeing the opposite. And I fear this is the kind of, let's say, obsequious financial market activity in association with the dollar, not even because Trump is a militaristic bully, but because unfortunately the volatility in the world economy means that some of the major sources of that volatility, the deregulated US financial system, which has given us crash after crash, big bankruptcies, and of course geopolitical turmoil. But when that happens, people go to something they consider safe, which is the US dollar. That's the great tragedy that I think the BRICS, unfortunately, haven't found a way to break out of. And maybe they don't want to because, frankly, their ruling classes here in Johannesburg or Pretoria or Sao Paulo, Brazil, or in Mumbai, India, or in Shanghai, China, the financial districts are all basically still westward gazing.
Mm-hmm. So is it true then? Well, you answered the question, but is it for decades to come? That, in fact, then tells us that BRICS has a long time to work on this.
Well, it's interesting because the phraseology gives you a sense of whether there's an immediate possibility of a multipolar system, right? The unipolar, Western-centric and multilateral institutions, the World Bank, IMF, World Trade Organization, and especially, most important, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Those institutions have partially assimilated the BRICS, and the G20 is where that most explicitly happens. But even just a week and a half ago in Baku, Azerbaijan, we saw the South African Environment Minister, the Democratic Alliance former shadow finance minister, neoliberal, former SADF fighter. His name's Dion George. He sided with the West against Africa. It's very, very explicit. And this is what the BRICS do because they don't want to cut emissions. They don't want to acknowledge a climate debt. And they would rather privatize the air, that is, impose carbon markets where big rich people can buy the right to pollute. And that's the, let me say, assimilation I see happening in the G20. I was in Rio a couple of weeks ago to witness how Lula, the president of Brazil, managed that process. And India, last year, Narendra Modi did the same. This year, Cyril Ramaphosa has a responsibility to fuse Western interests and the emerging economy interests, which, frankly, I think work against the vast majority of ordinary people and, of course, planetary survival. And therefore, instead of a unipolar West or a multipolar assimilation process of imperial and sub-imperial powers, I think we'd all rather see a non-polar system that works in the interests of society and environment.
Mm-hmm. So in conclusion, it's just something that occurred to me now, and I don't know if it's relevant, but the question is, there's a lot of trade between China and South Africa, right? So does that have any impact on what we're talking about?
Yes, I mean, the main impact is going to be more on the investment side because we've had a Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in September, which kickstarted the single biggest project ever proposed, up to $40 billion. But the first stage will be ferrochrome, and that's the Masina Mercado Special Economic Zone, and that's near the Zimbabwe border. But it's very controversial with plenty of opposition from local communities, conservationists, climate activists. So we'll have to watch that space. The trade relations usually depend upon the price of our minerals, since China is the main importer of our platinum group metals and is very important in even coal, as is India, unfortunately, as is Israel. So watch the price of metals. So gold has been up at a record high platinum has been falling, but might rebound if we have a green economy based upon using platinum with green hydrogen as a sort of battery cell. And then we obviously watch steel and iron ore and all the rest of it, but that's usually the determinant, the international price of whether our Chinese trade, our exports of minerals and metals is at the same level of our regrettably high imports. And that's, of course, the reason we've so deindustrialized. We have such a small manufacturing in labor-intensive clothing, textiles, appliances, electronics, footwear, and so forth, because we are too dependent, aren't we, on the Chinese imports, and we haven't really put enough into a genuine reindustrialization project here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Professor Patrick Bond. We'll wait to see if we catch a cold when Trump sneezes, or if he does.
Or pneumonia. Yeah.
Oopsie daisy. That's something to be thinking about. Anyway, thank you so much for your time this morning,
Thank you.
Professor. All the best. Have a wonderful day.
You too.
Thanks. Bye. All right. Up next, we have our next guest standing by.